Good evening, everyone, and welcome to day two, I guess I should say, of Monsoon Awareness Week. Yesterday, we had a great discussion about the monsoon threat of heat and all the different things that go along with that. But today, we're going to talk about a double. You're getting two for one for tonight. We're going to be talking about downburst winds, and then, of course, so many times one of the main threats associated with downburst winds are the dust storms or the haboobs associated with those dust storms. And you see me doing this, and we'll explain why I'm doing this here in a minute. But we will be talking about downburst winds and haboobs on our hangout tonight. I'm really excited. We got a lot of people on the hangout joining me for the discussion tonight. Let's run down the list here real quickly. Oh, I guess I should introduce myself first. My name's Tim Bryce. I'm a forecaster with the National Weather Service in El Paso, Texas. Also joining me on the call, also from the El Paso Weather Office, is Mr. Jason Laney. He is our warning coordination meteorologist. How you doing, Jason?
Hey, doing good. And I believe we got somebody from San Diego that'll be popping in here in just a few minutes, Mr. Dan Gregoria. But glad to be here. Hope this
very
goes
good.
well.
Very good. Also joining me on the call from the Albuquerque Weather Office is Randall Heggert. Did I say that right, Randall?
Randall Hergert.
Hergert. Oh, I was so close.
Close.
Yeah, he's a forecaster there in beautiful ABQ. Also joining us on the call from the beautiful and pristine Flagstaff region is Miss Megan Taylor. How are you, Miss Megan?
Hi, doing well, thank you.
What is your current temperature there in Flagstaff?
You know, we hit 81 today. It was our first 80-degree day of the year. Woo!
There you go. I know that we've already been 100 here in El Paso, so I'm a little jealous. And also joining us from the Las Vegas office is Mr. Chris Outler. Chris, how are you doing? He's a forecaster there.
Hey, pretty good.
Very good, very good. And last but not least, our technical expert on the call today is Dr. Tom Gill. He's a professor of environmental sciences at the University of Texas at El Paso. How are you doing, Dr. Gill?
Good. Great to be here, guys.
Very good. All right. So, look who's joined me. Hello. The joys of doing live television from home. All right, so we're going to open things up, and we're going to be talking about downbursts. I think that people have heard of downbursts, but we get them all kind of mixed up in our heads with tornadoes and just winds. And what's the difference between the winds that we see in the spring versus a downburst wind? And I was wondering, maybe Randall, can you kind of give us a definition of what a downburst is?
Yes, I can. So a downburst wind is a very strong and powerful wind that emanates downward from a thunderstorm. And once it hits the ground, it emanates from that impact point radially outward from the thunderstorm, producing very strong winds. And to differentiate them from tornadoes, they're straight line winds as compared to any tornado winds that you might see.
Very good. And then we'll dig a little deeper on the different hazards that that kind of wind can present. But before we do, I got two things. First of all, we got somebody else joining us on the call. This is Dan. How you doing, Dan? Oh, you have a friend.
Hey, doing good. I'm from San Diego. Dan Gregoria here and Samantha Connolly.
Very good. I'm so glad that you guys could join us on the hangout today. We just got started. We just had Randall going over the what a microburst is, and then I was gonna. The other thing that I wanted to do is mention to everybody, and Jason can remind me. I think we made it 25 minutes into the hangout yesterday when I told everyone that they could tweet us a question. So I'm doing better. We're only 4 minutes into the presentation today. So if you do have a question when we're doing the hangout, feel free to tweet at us. I'm following the hashtag Monsoon 2019. So if you do have a question for any of the panelists today, feel free to just tweet at us with that hashtag Monsoon 2019, or you can drop me an email at tim.bryce@noaa.gov, and we'll try to get that answered. So we were talking about the downburst, and Randall did a great job of, it's just that, the way I describe it when I talk to kids at school, it's like a water balloon. If you've ever seen a water balloon, as it hits the ground, it starts to spread out in all directions. That water, if you drop it on the top of the table, Mom won't be happy if you do that, but if you drop it on the table, it spreads out in all directions, and that's what the same thing happens on these downbursts. It's like just a big ball of cooled water, air, and it drops straight out of the thunderstorm and then hits the ground and spreads out in all directions. But correct me if I'm wrong. Anyone can jump in here. Not all thunderstorms produce these microbursts. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Not all thunderstorms can produce them, but certainly during this time of year, they are fairly common.
So I guess from a forecaster perspective, and as we talk to people in the general public, how do we detect those? Is there like a radar signature that you can look for? Is there satellite? I think a lot of people, especially like in the Midwest, they're all familiar with what a tornado looks like on radar. You've got the hook echo, you've got these inbound and outbound, you've got the greens and reds right next to each other. I don't think that people are nearly as familiar with how the Weather Service goes about trying to detect these downbursts. And I don't know, Dan, if you guys there in San Diego, do you guys understand how can you explain how the Weather Service, some of the tools that we use to help detect those downbursts?
Yes, looking at Doppler radar, sometimes if you see mid-level convergence in a thunderstorm, that's a precursor to that storm potentially producing a downburst. Now, at the surface, this is already too late, but if at the surface you have inbound, outbound velocities going opposite each other, that's indicating that a downburst is occurring at that moment. But, of course, we want to get a heads up. So if you have a, fairly good core aloft and you have that inverted V signature indicating dry air below, which will produce a lot of evaporative cooling, that's indicative of heightened downburst potential.
So you guys, even the public can look at those soundings. And the reason we tell people every day, a lot of weather offices do balloon soundings, and they take the measurement of the temperature and relative humidity. And believe it or not, when you see kind of that sounding kind of makes the shape of a walking man, we call it a stick man or a walking man. That's indicative of a sounding that could potentially produce a downburst. I did want to real quickly show everybody as we were moving along here what a downburst looks like. So I've got this video here of a downburst that occurred just to the west of El Paso. Very conveniently, lots of people were up on the side of a mountain to watch it. But if you can watch it, if it plays here, you can see how it has 1, 2, 3 drops real quickly straight out of it. And then it just quickly goes and goes. It's just like this sudden rush of rain and wind that drops straight out of it. And I know it was kind of hard to tell from this video, and I'll back up and do it again. But basically, also spreading out from the base of that is this ring of dust, just like Dan was talking about. It spreads out in all directions, so you can actually see that on the radar as it spreads out in all directions. Now, this particular downburst conveniently fell right on top of NWS El Paso, our weather office, and it produced, I forget, and can you remind me, what was the wind speeds there at the office?
I believe we hit 72 or 78 miles per hour, 72 miles per hour.
That's impressive. So it just dropped right on top of the office there, and the radar. And I don't know, Jason, can you dig around? I don't know if you can find the radar signature from that. I don't know if we have that saved anywhere, but it would be just like what Dan was talking about. You see that ring going out.
All right.
From that.
While you guys talk, I'll look for it, and if I find it, I'll bring it up. Very
good. Now, sometimes people may have heard that there's a dry microburst and a wet microburst, and there can be some confusion on what's the difference. And Ms. Megan, I was wondering if you can explain the differences between those two.
Sure, you bet. So, like you said, there are wet microbursts and there are dry microbursts, and they both produce wind, and they both actually usually produce rain too. But it just so happens that the wet microbursts are more forced by the precipitation loading. So you have this updraft that's upholding all this precipitation aloft in the atmosphere. And when it gets too heavy, it descends, and all that precipitation reaches the surface. And so most of the time, if it's raining really heavily, it's a wet microburst. But if you have a lot of dry air near the surface, like a lot of areas out here, then all that precipitation falling into a dry atmosphere will evaporate. And that can lead to even stronger, more enhanced winds, accelerating winds, if you will. So those are more of our dry microbursts. Now, here in Flagstaff, we see a combination of both all across northern Arizona. We see dry microbursts, we see wet microbursts, and we see some that are a little of both. So like a lot of things in nature, it's not always just one or the other. Some tend to be drier than others and some are wetter. They're not always one side of the spectrum or the other, but that's kind of the differentiation. You tend to associate wet microbursts with very heavy precipitation and dry microbursts with more wind, essentially.
Very good. You know, so many of us have evaporative coolers in the Southwest that cool our houses. And if you think about it, that evaporation that takes place on the roof, and then you get that cool air coming into your house, just like Miss Megan was saying, it's very similar to what's happening in that storm. You've got all the water being upheld by the updraft, but as it starts to descend, as it raindrops, it evaporates. And as that evaporative process is a cooling process, and then that cooler air is heavier than the air around it, so it just speeds up. And if you've got the right kind of conditions with that moisture on top of that dry air, it can really accelerate down, just like Megan was saying, and can really, then it hits that ground and spreads out. And that leads right into what Mr. Jason has here on his graphic. This is what happens when a microburst falls right on top of your radar. Go ahead and run it again, Jason.
Yeah, this is just an animated GIF, and you see these concentric circles starting to go out and kind of draw a line out where they're going to go. That is actually, this is what we call our reflectivity signature, and that is basically dust and anything else that's getting picked up or little bits of moisture and kind of tossed up in the sky right along the leading edge of the wind. But we've got a better way to look at that, and that's with what we call our velocities from the radar. When you see the greens, that's wind that's blowing in towards the radar, and the red is wind that's blowing away from it. So what happened, this pocket of cold, wet air, this wet microburst descended literally right on top of our radar. That's the big black blob that you see right there in the middle. It hit the ground and it literally spread out concentrically, circular, all the way out. And we had, of course, the 72-mile-per-hour winds here, but we had severe type winds, which would be winds 58 miles per hour or greater, stretching out some 15 to 18 miles from the center of where this thing hit and made landfall. I guess landfall is not the right word, but where it impacted the ground.
So, and as we were talking about, as that microburst hits the ground, it spreads out, and a lot of times it kicks up a lot of dust, and that dust kind of swirls up and then spreads out, just like Jason was saying. And a lot of times people may have heard of it called like a dust storm or a sandstorm, but a term that also some people have been throwing around are haboobs. And I was wondering, Dr. Gill, can you kind of tell us what a haboob is, and then maybe some of the threats are associated with that?
Sure. In the same way that, you know, not every snowstorm is a blizzard, so to speak. Not every dust storm is what we call a haboob. Haboob comes from an Arabic word from this area of Sudan that I think generally means strong wind. Now, those of us here in the Southwest, most of us are familiar with, I guess we'd call them the garden variety dust storms, where the wind starts rising and blowing over the course of the day, and dust starts coming up, blowing out of everywhere. A haboob is very different. A haboob is specifically a dust storm that is caused by, the scientists would say, a density current or a gravity current, but specifically in our region, a haboob is generally caused by these very strong winds, these very strong downdrafts coming out of a thunderstorm, where in this case you might have, there we see a haboob, a dry microburst, or these very strong winds or downdrafts, dry, coming out of the storm, hitting the ground, and very suddenly kicking up a spectacular wall of dust, like we see there on the video, into maybe an otherwise dust-free or clear sky. So unlike our garden variety dust storms that we get more in the winter or spring in the Southwest, a haboob generally comes during the monsoon season, during the rainy season, and it's this massive wall of onrushing wind and sand and dust and dirt that gets blown out by the downdrafts of a storm into maybe an otherwise clear sky, that can come with extremely strong winds and can really come out of the blue, so to speak. And that's why there is a great hazard with these particular types of dust storms, in that you may not expect them coming. You know, the sky may otherwise be clear and not even windy, and there's this dramatic and spectacular wall of dirt and dust that comes at you, and a very, very sudden and sharp drop in visibility, kind of like an avalanche coming down a ski slope. And in fact, scientifically, they're caused by very similar properties that would cause a snow avalanche in the mountains. And that's where there's a great hazard from them, is that just the sudden sharpness, like we can see, where the visibility and the wind will, you know, go from very nice conditions to extreme conditions literally within moments. They're particularly dramatic, and probably, as many of these photos we see here have their greatest hazard, and probably in North America best developed in Arizona, especially between Phoenix and Tucson. But really anywhere in the Southwest, from California to Texas, and even beyond to Oklahoma and other places, there is the hazard of these haboob type monsoon dust storms during the rainy season.
Very good. All right. Good explanation of that. Hey, Chris, I was wondering, can you kind of expand upon the hazards that are associated with the downburst and with these dust storms? Dr. Gill kind of touched on them, but I was wondering if you could expand upon them. That you know, why does the Weather Service pay attention to them, and why do we need to let people know that they're coming?
Sure. Well, the biggest hazard really is related to travel. We've seen an increasing incidence of dust storms even in our area near Las Vegas. Last summer especially, we issued over a dozen dust storm warnings in our particular area. And it's because they are potentially so dangerous to travelers who are caught in them. The visibility, like mentioned before, can drop very, very quickly. It can go from clear visibility exceeding 10 miles to visibility, you know, less than a quarter mile in just a few seconds. So, you know, if you're a traveler caught in that type of event, it can strike very suddenly and really catch you off guard. So that's really the biggest hazard. Of course, there's also hazards to air quality. You know, breathing in all of that dust can be particularly unhealthy, and it can also lead to incidences of valley fever and other respiratory issues for sensitive groups. So that's the really big drawback with the dust storms themselves. Now, if you are caught out in a dust storm, if you're out driving in them, the biggest thing to be aware of is to try to pull off the road, stop your car, turn off your lights. And a lot of times we get questions as to why would we turn off the lights? You know, you're in a dust storm, you'd want people to be able to see you. But the problem is that if you have your taillights on and people are following behind you in a dust storm and the visibility drops really rapidly, the other drivers could actually follow you and crash into you potentially. So that's why we recommend that advice. But ultimately, try to avoid the situation altogether. I'll tell you from firsthand experience, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so I'm used to heavy fog, dense fog, and that type of stuff. And that's always what I envisioned a haboob looking like. But when I caught myself in my first haboob, it really is another level of danger. It's extremely difficult to see if it's a particularly strong haboob. and I couldn't see more than about 20 feet out into the distance with the dust. So it really is dangerous if you are caught out in them, and we recommend avoiding dust storms at all costs. If you can delay your travel when there's dust storm warning, please do.
You know, I've got this video. I think a lot of us in the Weather Service have seen this video, but I like to show it to the kids because it's just like Dr. Gill and Chris were talking about, this big wall of dust coming at you, and you can actually see it's a nice sunny day. You can see the thunderstorm in the background, but the sun is out. And as this gentleman is driving forward, he's got his kids in his car, and just like Chris was saying, when this is headed towards you, it's probably best to get off where it just said exit there instead of driving straight in it, because you will see just how quickly they go from a nice sunny day down to practically zero visibility. It's just very telling, very impressive video. I mean, it gets so bad that he turns on his lights, and not that that really helps much, but you can see the visibility is just practically just barely looking over the end of the. Oh, now you can't even see anything there over the hood of his car. So very dramatic change, and that happened so quickly. That's a 1-minute video. He went from clear visibility all of a sudden down to zero visibilities in about a minute. So definitely, just like Chris was saying, definitely a threat to people driving around. He also mentioned valley fever, which we'll touch on here in a second. And then, of course, there's also the threat to aviation. But real quickly, before we get to a valley fever, I'm trying to guide Jason here because he jumped to valley fever. But before we get to valley fever, Chris also mentioned some products that we were issued. And Jason, I was wondering, what are the different, because we've heard dust storm warning thrown out there. There's these dust advisories. What are the products that the Weather Service issues to kind of help people to know that this inclement kind of weather is approaching them?
All right. Well, we actually have a couple of products that go out. Actually, they're now 4, believe it or not. Used to be a couple. Our neighbors over in Arizona in the Phoenix and Tucson office actually started this a year or so back with these new products. But let me go ahead and show what's going on now. And these are actually being put out by all the offices here. We have what we call dust advisories and dust storm warnings. And the difference basically between an advisory and a warning there would be primarily the visibility. When we have a dust advisory, we have visibility of, say, a quarter mile to about a mile. And when we go to dust storm warning, well, the visibility is generally less than a quarter of a mile. Both of these, however, are what we call polygon based. And I'll explain that here in a minute. But we also have something that covers a much larger territory that we call zone based. And those are blowing dust advisories and blowing dust warnings. So notice the difference between these two. One has blowing in front of it, one doesn't. And basically the blowing dust advisories and warnings, they cover large areas. We tend to see those more in the springtime in the desert Southwest when we get these big wind systems that cover several states and pick up dirt from the various dust sources. But the dust advisory and the dust storm warning, the ones that we're calling polygon based there, well, those are the ones you're going to see more during the monsoon season. Now, I'm showing you our area here in El Paso. You see all these numbers, 406, 405, 411, 413. Those are different zones, and each different forecast office has their own zones. But to kind of show you the difference, in the old days, and we still do this in the spring, the blowing dust, which is a large area, notice I've got that in red there, and it covers a large area there in southwestern parts of New Mexico. But when we get these individual thunderstorms, like the ones that just kick up localized dust, some of the haboobs that can take place there, well, many times those are more isolated, and it really makes no sense to warn for a large area. So that's where this new dust storm warning comes into effect. So you can see it concentrates on one little area, and I have this one in here because this is an area where we tend to have lots of problems and accidents. But to back it up again, remember, an advisory, 1/4 to 1 mile visibility, and a warning means the visibility tends to go down below about 1/4 of a mile. So that's one of the keys that we tend to put there. And these products are being issued by all of the Weather Service offices here across the southwestern United States.
And those, Jason, correct me, those are just kind of new products, so people may not even be familiar with those.
Yeah, the with used to just be dust advisories and dust warnings, and those were kind of the big ones there. The new ones, though, now the dust advisory, dust warnings, the one that go into just like a severe thunderstorm warning, or say maybe a tornado warning if we were to have one of those, or a flood warning, flash flood warning. So yes, we're just starting to use those area wide this year. As a matter of fact, we issued our first couple from our office right here in El Paso, actually back before monsoon season could even get started. It was several months ago, but you'll probably see those a lot, and those will be popping up in Twitter feeds and showing up on people's cell phones from time to time. And hopefully folks will be able to heed those warnings and stay safe and take some of the advice that our colleagues were talking about just a few minutes ago.
Well, that was the quick question I did want to ask you real quickly is the dust storm warning, is that WIA alert? And when I say WIA, for everyone who doesn't know what those are the warnings that we get on our, like Jason said, our cell phones. Because believe it or not, you don't, when the Weather Service issues a severe thunderstorm warning, I don't think that shows up on our phones, but like a tornado warning, a flash flood warning, I know that dust storm warnings used to, but I don't know if they changed that. Does anyone know off the top of your heads?
To the best of my knowledge, Tim, these do not trigger the WEA, the WEA alerts. That would be the wireless emergency alert. Those actually feed through something called iPause that come through some of the local emergency managers there, and I don't believe those have been programmed in just yet. So right now it's primarily flash flood warnings and tornado warnings because they're trying to cut down on some of the excessive alerts that go out. But who knows? That could be changing in the future.
Well, I would say that I know that 5 years ago I issued a dust storm warning, and at that time it lit up. It was over just for a very small area of one of our counties, but it crossed into two counties, and the counties out in the west, as everyone knows, are very large, and it lit up everybody's cell phones in these two counties, even if they were 30, 40 miles away. So I know that they've been trying to adjust that. And just like Jason said, they were trying to kind of narrow that down so we don't unnecessarily alert people that that dust product has been issued. So I do think it's important that we able to get the word out, especially for those dust warnings where we're using that polygon, because if you're in that polygon, that little square box or whatever shape that it ends up being, that's why we call it a polygon, that you want to be very aware that you have that potential to very quickly be seeing some dust and some very low visibilities headed your way. Now we did Chris mentioned it and Jason mentioned it a minute ago. One of the other hazards related to all that dust, because I keep doing this, because as that cold ball of air hits the ground and spreads out, it kind of curls up, and so what it does is it picks up that dust and it rolls it along. But as it's picking up that dust, it gets everything that's in the ground, and most of the time that's just sand and dirt. But sometimes, unfortunately, it picks up some other things that are there that are not healthy for us. And I think we all can realize that, trying to breathe in a bunch of dusty air is not the best thing for us. But actually, there is a sickness that is many times spread by this dust. And Dr. Gill, I was wondering if you could touch on what valley fever is and how it is spread by these dust storms.
Yes, Tim, we're talking about valley fever, or the specific medical term is, it's really complicated. It's something like coccidioidomycosis. So much easier to just say valley fever.
Easy for you to say.
Exactly. I'm not a medical doctor, but valley fever is a growing risk and a growing hazard that we're becoming more and more aware is a hazard related to the fact that dust storms can make you sick if you breathe too much of this dust and dirt that's blown out by them. What valley fever is it's a fungal disease that is caused by the spores of a fungus that is native to our desert soil in the Southwest, most common in Southern California and Arizona. It got the name valley fever because it was best known from the San Joaquin Valley in Southern and Central California. But we now realize, as you can see on the map, that it can be found anywhere from California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and also much of New Mexico and West Texas. It is the spore of a fungus that lives in the soil that can be stirred up and kicked up by that dust that comes blowing with those strong drown drafts from a thunderstorm. And if you are unlucky enough to breathe either too many of these spores, be in the wrong place in the wrong time, or be the unlucky person who has these spores that decide to make a home in your lungs, in your body, in your respiratory tract, you may become very sick. The other point is it's not just people, it's other animals, especially our pets. Horses and dogs can be very susceptible to valley fever. Many of us who live in the Southwest have probably been exposed to valley fever. Some of the medical experts I've talked to say that probably those of us who have lived a long time in the desert have been exposed to valley fever and maybe contracted it and not even know it. Like many diseases, many of us can be exposed to it and successfully fight it off. You might feel like you have like a cold or some bad allergies or maybe fighting off that bug that's going around after a dust storm. But if you're unfortunate, you can get very sick. And it's underreported, and the medical community, the healthcare community is probably not as aware of the risks and the potential incidence of valley fever as they should be. So in many cases, people who will get sick with some sort of respiratory or just generally feeling sick after a dust storm get diagnosed with other diseases, maybe pneumonia, maybe asthma, maybe bronchitis, and maybe are not given the right treatments as a result of that. Valley fever is a fungal disease. It's caused by the spores of a fungus. So really if you are suffering from valley fever, there are tests that are now available for it that you can be specifically tested for this disease. And if it turns out that you do have it, there are very specific medications that are used to treat fungal infections that can be given to you and can help you fight it off. So primarily, as you will see in the graph, most of the cases are in Arizona and California, but we're now realizing that in other places, West Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, it's probably underreported just because we're not aware of that hazard. So if you have been exposed to dust, either from one of these dust storms, haboobs, and you've breathed in the dirt, or you've been maybe like working in a construction site or in some sort of occupation where you're digging up the soil or exposed to soil that has been kicked up by the wind, and after that you start feeling sick and you don't get better, it's not a bad idea to check with a medical professional and ask, might have I been exposed to valley fever? If you're not getting better, get tested, be aware of valley fever. There are some excellent resources on valley fever that are out there. Be aware of them and be aware that, breathing too much dust and sand and dirt after one of these storms, can lead to health consequences. And be aware of any symptoms you develop and realize that now there are tests that are available for it. And if you're getting sick after being exposed to blowing dust and sand, get checked out and raise with your clinic or your medical healthcare provider the possibility that, hey, can you check me out for valley fever? Same thing again, if your pets or other animals, after they are exposed to some very, very dusty and sandy winds, show symptoms of not feeling well, especially having respiratory problems, have them, make sure that the veterinarian is aware that, valley fever is something we have to deal with in this region, especially during this time of year when we may be exposed to these strong concentrations of dust and sand in the air.
So I was joined, speaking of our pets, I've been joined by mine. one of my dogs here. But we talked about pets yesterday when we were talking about heat. Jason talked about when walking your dog, make sure that the ground is not super duper hot. Make sure that we're able to get our pets with plenty of water. This is the same thing. Just be aware that your pet is, if you have an outside pet, you can just have them be sure if they start to act in a way that they're having respiratory problems, take them to the vet and have them checked out for that. I think that's a very good advice. Randall, I was wondering, going to kind of switch gears here. Because we were talking about valley fever, but one thing we haven't touched on yet is the threat of these downburst winds, because we've talked about driving into them, we've talked about the dust associated with them, but the aviation industry has a very great threat to these downburst winds. I'm wondering if you can talk about that, and I got a graphic to kind of show what that looks like.
Right, so the aviation impacts can be quite serious. Because of how powerful these winds can be, they can range anywhere between 45-mile-per-hour gusts all the way up to 100-mile-per-hour gusts. And with them being having very short warning, or only having a short period of warning time, they can produce some very dangerous crosswinds across the airport runways and cause dangerous landing and takeoff conditions for any aviation interests.
Yeah,
and as in the graphic there, you can also see it's not just at the surface. Also, the upper parts of these gust fronts that radiate out from the thunderstorm can reach up several hundred feet or even a couple thousand feet and cause some dangerous turbulence as well.
I think when it comes to pilots, as I was reading about this, is that the microburst is the exact worst thing that they can happen. Because what happens is that as they're coming into land, if the microburst is in front of them, it ends up, as that wind first hits them, it looks like they're gaining speed when they're trying to land. So what do? They actually power down even further. Then, as this graphic shows, they get into the middle of it, and now that they've actually lowered their power, they get that downrush of wind. And just when they need the most power to kind of pull them through that, they backed off on the power. And that downburst wind just shoves them right down into the ground. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know there's been several accidents related to a downburst, and mainly I want to say it was Delta Airlines back in the 80s or the 90s in Dallas.
Right, at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, there was unfortunately a Delta Airlines crash in one of these downbursts that took many, many lives that I think really open the eyes of the aviation and weather community of the great hazards that this can present to aircraft, especially landing and taking off.
Yeah, and like I said, it's almost like a trap. It makes the pilot think and do the exact wrong things as they're landing into it. All right. I think we've been going here about 38 minutes. Thank everyone for sticking around with us. Again, if you've got a question for us, I did want to give you the opportunity to ask us. So use that hashtag at Monsoon, hashtag Monsoon 2019 on Twitter, or drop me a quick email at tim.bryce@noaa.gov, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. We've touched on, how this impacts the aviation community. I also want to, when we touched on real briefly what can happen as you drive into one of these dust storms, and we said if you don't drive into them if you don't have to. But Miss Megan, if you do happen to drive into one of these dust storms, can you kind of step us through the steps that we're supposed to take to be safe and kind of protect ourselves from that?
Sure. So I probably have the least experience living up here in Flagstaff, and I would imagine, out in Vegas or Phoenix, the southern deserts, probably everybody's been in one before. I have not, but I do know that what you're supposed to do is, first things first, pull off to the side of the road. So first, you just want to get yourself out of the situation. So pull all the way off the road, not half on the shoulder, half in the road. You pull yourself all the way off the road. You want to make sure to put your car into park. And you want to put I believe you want to put your emergency brake on. And then, as Chris was talking about, you want to make sure to turn off all your lights. And that can be a little confusing. We had a question today, actually, on our social media about why is that? That doesn't make sense. You want to make sure people see you. But what you don't want is people to mistake you for being where they should be driving. And so the idea is that you don't want to be hit from behind from somebody that's trying to follow you. So those are some of the best things you can do. Of course, you want to make sure you're aware of the weather before you head out. And if there's a possibility of something like this, have a plan. Know that you need to get off the road. Keep an eye on where your exits are. I did pull up a reference here for the warnings and advisories, and indeed the polygon-based dust storm warning will be a WEA message.
Oh,
so
very good.
I guess they have set that up, but it's only the polygon-based one. So if it's a big zone, you're not going to get the WEA for that. But the polygon-based one, so if you're in your car and you're within that warning, you should receive the alert via your phone. So if you get that alert, maybe you're far enough away, you don't see it. If you're within the box, you're probably going to see it. So if you do get that alert, know the first thing you want to do, pull off the road. And from there, you want to put it in park, get the brake on, turn the lights off.
So that's very good news, because that's actually the way it should be. Like I mentioned earlier, when it's that zone-based thing, it can cover just such a wide area that's only being impacted by a little one. So I'm glad to hear that for that polygon, if you are in that polygon, it's just like the tornado warning or the flash flood warning. When we issue those warnings in the Weather Service, we actually just draw a little box on a map saying this is the area of the greatest threat. And so that if you're in that area, that's the area that generally gets alerted on our cell phones. So that's great that they're going to do that also for the dust storm warnings, because in the past, unfortunately, we have seen in southern New Mexico, and I'm sure that in Arizona it's happened as well. But Jason, I was wondering if you could kind of talk people through what has happened out in the desert west of Lordsburg in New Mexico, where we've had unfortunately not one but two very serious accidents out there, basically caused by these haboobs.
All right, I will do that. I thought I had an image of that carnage that took place. I do right quick. Let me see if I can share that right quick with everybody. This was the first. Well, wait a minute. I'm on the wrong slide. Let's come back up here. It's tough when you're trying to do this thing on the fly from time to time. So there we go. This was actually on May 22nd, 2014. A couple of years later, same thing happened. And what was happening in this particular situation, this stretch of Interstate 10, which runs between El Paso and Tucson, that's about the midway point between the two major cities there, carries a lot of traffic, a lot of tourists, maybe folks headed out to Disney and that thing, lots of commercial traffic there with the big trucks. And we literally had a weak thunderstorm in this area, probably more virga than anything else. That was rain evaporating before it hit the ground, but it hit a very dusty location, a lot of loose soils. We call these playas in this part of the country, and they're basically just like dry lake beds that are covered with sand in them, and that's something that Dr. Gill has been researching a lot. But what would happen every time we'd get one of these thunderstorms, it would just kick up this wall of dirt, and instantly you would go with no warning whatsoever into a major dust storm. And obviously cars, their first reaction, the knee-jerk reaction there would be, hey, I'm going to put on the brake. And then you've got this large truck behind you. It can't stop as quick. And it just really was a mess there. And I mentioned it happened a couple of years later in the very same spot. So what they've done now, they found out that a lot of the problems there was if you give this enough time and enough natural vegetation forms, it kind of creates a nice little crust, and it's not as susceptible to tossing up as much dust. We had a lot of cattle out in that area, and the cattle was roaming around. As they would walk across, they'd break up the crust there, and then all of a sudden here comes the wind. So what we've been working on, lots of things, planting some natural vegetation, actually creating little holes in the soil for water to gather and hopefully get some of the natural vegetation to start growing there. That's one side from the horticultural side they're working. The other is they're starting to fence this off to keep the cattle out. It took identifying the problem, folks thinking about how to fix that, And a lot of folks in the community, including the New Mexico Department of Transportation, NMDOT, along with researchers like Dr. Gill and the New Mexico state climatologist, Dr. David Dubois, all of these folks have been very instrumental in kind of leading the charge to get experts out there and saying this is a very dangerous situation. We need to do something about it. And things are getting done. It's still a slow process, but hopefully it's going to continue to improve in time.
Hey, Dr. Gill, I know that you were part of that process. Can you real briefly just kind of walk us through what they're doing out there in just to the west of the town of Lordsburg?
Yeah, I mean, the real problem, unfortunately, is that you've got a major interstate highway, one of the nation's great transportation arteries, that goes smack dab across the middle of one of the most intense dust hotspots in the Southwest. So, as several of you have said, this is a recipe for disaster. So we're really working many different agencies, from the Bureau of Land Management, the transportation agencies, New Mexico State, UTEP, and a number of agencies trying to find ways to do things such as maybe put some ground cover in the most dust emissive areas, find ways of treating or controlling or keeping that surface of the ground hard and crusted, and keep that debris off of it that can kick up the dust. As was mentioned earlier, trying to fence out or keep out the cattle that can break up the crust. And unfortunately, places like dry playas or lake beds, they're kind of an attractive nuisance to some humans because they're a great place to take out your dune buggy or your off-road vehicle and go zooming around out there. And yes, it's fun, but unfortunately, that's exactly what you're doing is you're breaking up the surface and you're just pulverizing that surface of that dry lake bed into loose dirt to be picked up by the wind. So, for example, the Bureau of Land Management is very strictly posting and trying to restrict off-road vehicles from chewing up the land off the highway. And of course, if you've ever driven that stretch of interstate between Tucson and El Paso in either directions, to really increase the signage to motorists, both fixed signs warning travelers that it is a very, very dust prone area, and also to have those interactive highway signs where the messages can be flashed during periods of hazard that a potential serious dust hazard is ahead. Be aware. And unfortunately, when it gets really bad to some points, the public safety agencies, the highway patrol and state troopers, even have to shut down the highway and reroute the traffic at great cost of time and money, but I think a necessary evil, away from that stretch that crosses that dust hazard zone onto alternative roads, just so that that blinding dust hazard can be avoided. Because really, actually, some of the research shows that over the past dozens of years, unfortunately more than 55 people have been killed in wrecks on that one stretch of highway related to dust storms. And we're trying to find, many different agencies are working to try to find ways to minimize and mitigate that hazard.
As they should. And unfortunately, it seems like almost every year we have someone who sadly loses their life in a fatality accident related to dust. Yeah. But we've been kind of hitting on Arizona and West Texas and New Mexico. But I want to ask Dan, out there in sunny, beautiful Southern California, you guys don't have problems with these dust storms, do you?
Nah.
Actually, we do. In our from the Coachella Valley, the San Diego deserts points east into Imperial County, which is Phoenix's WFO area, but our area too, our San Diego County deserts. Actually, last year we had a good Haboob signature on our radar. that enter the San Diego County deserts. So yeah, we do deal with dust storms in our area. And I wanted to mention, I'm going to share the screen here. We were talking about the microbursts. And a lot of times they're like, you know, in the El Paso case, it went some, I think you said 15 to 20 miles out. We had a case last year that was very localized. And I'll show you the picture here. Let's see, entire screen. Let's see here. Because I wanted, this was an interesting, whoa.
Just minimize, just minimize that and go to the screen now because you are sharing your screen. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Are you seeing the damage pictures? So
yes.
So this was an interesting, so this was a thunderstorm that developed in the Beaumont area near the Banning Pass. And this thunderstorm cell actually, because our radar beam goes up and out, it wasn't able to sample this thunderstorm cell. It produced a downburst, and it was in a very localized area, right, Sam?
Yeah, it was in a park, in Sylvan Park in Beaumont, and it was just a really small park, and the damage was just exclusively in that park. The houses that were right across the street sustained no damage at all, and there was some haze there. But yeah, the houses right across the street had no damage, and it was very localized to just this part.
So we were just bringing this case up. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, radar may not actually pick up the downburst signature, and you know, you can have these, you know, high impacts in a very small area.
And that can always be a challenge for messaging because, unlike the tornado, like we were talking about, tornadoes have very clear signatures on the radars many times, whereas this maybe not so. So that can be kind of a challenge to see. Hey, Chris, we talked about one of the threats was to you know, the driving community, and I imagine one of the challenges you guys face there in Las Vegas is that you have such a transient community, people in and out, people are flying into Vegas. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, all kinds of stuff like that. So you always have this constant churn of, I guess, tourists. How do you guys, you know, they have, you know, if they're coming from the East Coast or coming from other countries, they have no idea that these things potential. Do you guys try to message in any way to kind of educate people and let them know the potential of these things, or when they're occurring, how you might message them? Oh, wait, you're muted, sir. Let me see if we can unmute you.
All right,
okay, there you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. We definitely have a lot of transient type people that are always coming, lots of tourists. We also have people coming up from Phoenix to Las Vegas, and there's a couple of trouble spots along that route which get hit with dust storms relatively commonly. So there's a lot of different things that we do. Probably our primary source for messaging this type of information would be through our social media outlets. So whenever we issue a dust storm warning, that type of information certainly goes out on Twitter or on Facebook. Another thing that we do is we'll occasionally be posting just general safety tips. So we have some canned dust graphics that go out that say, you know, here's some dust storm safety tips. If you were caught in the dust, you know, pull off the road, turn off your lights, and things like that. We also frequently will share some of our community partner information. So I know ADOT has a really great video about dust storm hazards and what to do if you're caught in one. So we've shared that a few times. So those are some of the different ways that our information goes out. Of course, also like Megan mentioned, you know, the WEA alerts are also programmed to alert for the dust storms when those occur as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can get that information, also just straight off our website as well.
Very good, very good. I know that that's a unique challenge for your area of responsibility there with so many people coming to Las Vegas. Well, believe it or not, we've been talking for almost an hour here, so I want to take up, I appreciate everyone joining us on YouTube. I want to be mindful of your time. So real quickly, I kind of want to see if, I want to run down the line here and see, get everybody's last words. So Mr. Randall, what are some last words, some parting tips that you can leave for everybody?
I would say if you're planning any outdoor activities during the summertime, during this time of year, especially in the desert Southwest where we are, just take a quick look at your local WFO's forecast and see if there's any potential for any of these downburst winds that particular day, as well as the other hazards we're going to be talking about each night this week.
Exactly. Very good. Miss Megan, what are your final thoughts and words?
You know, I wanted to mention a threat that we haven't talked about, and I won't go too much into it, but it is fire season. And downburst winds can have a pretty big impact on fires across the Southwest as well. So be mindful of that. Changing winds can cause problems with wildfires. It is fire season. We're starting to see that ramp up here in Arizona. So just be mindful with wildfire season before the monsoon moisture arrives, and keep that in mind.
Definitely. And it's not an official kind of subject for Monsoon Awareness Week, but here's a sneak peek for everybody. We're going to be touching on that on Friday on our wrap-up hangout. So if you want to talk more about that, hear more information about that, please join us on Friday as we're going to talk about the threat of fire weather and debris flows associated during the monsoon season. Mr. Jason, what are your final thoughts? Oh, and you're muted, sir.
Okay, now you can hear me. Sorry about that.
Yes.
I was sitting across one here. Actually, wonderful stuff. I want to thank my colleague over at the Phoenix office, Ken Waters. Of course, Megan kind of got the jump on us and found out about that wireless emergency alert, but he did tweet us over there. He's watching in. So it's great to have. I just want to say a special thanks to all the Weather Service offices that are involved in this. I love seeing my colleagues around the Southwest and the passion that goes into this. And hopefully we're doing a real good job messaging the dangers. Everybody knows about flooding. People know about the dangers with lightning. But a lot of times wind and dust, it's just a little wind and dust. We can handle that. So I appreciate everybody taking the time today to really focus in on how important these dangers are, as well as having Dr. Tom Gill with us as well. Thanks a lot.
Very good. Chris, what are some final thoughts and words?
Well, the big thing is, it's summertime. During monsoon season, it's paired up with some of the most active time. A lot of people are outdoors, so just be prepared for the elements. They can strike really quickly, as we found with microburst and with the dust storm hazards. It can just be a matter of minutes between the weather going pretty tolerable to suddenly very severe. So just be prepared for that. Always keep your eye on the forecast. Check the forecast ahead of time if you're planning outdoor activities. And especially here in Las Vegas, we have a number of lakes that are in our forecast area. Lake Mead, Lake Havasu. So be aware of those hazards that are really multiplied out there, because if you're caught out, in the open water on a boat, the danger that a microburst can pose is really significant. So try to avoid getting yourself in that situation and plan your day around the weather.
That's a great tip. We here in the Southwest, we don't think about boating very often because we just don't have a lot of water. But you're exactly right. There are still some large recreational lakes that people get involved with, and golly, if you're caught out on one of these lakes with a microburst going down, that is a bad place to be. That is for sure. So that's a great tip. Good. Thank you. And Mr. Dan there in San Diego, what do you have for your parting thoughts?
All right, I echo the comments of my colleagues. Staying weather aware, always, you can follow us at NWS San Diego or the other offices, keeping mindful of the forecasts. We're fairly good at forecasting. We go weeks here, at least in Southern California, of fairly stagnant and quiet weather. But when monsoon season hits, we spread that message that there's potential thunderstorm activity and it could produce those dust storms that we talked about.
Very good. So always be aware that the change, you can go weeks there in Southern California, and then and same thing for El Paso. So I know we'll go weeks, but then all of a sudden we had a week of severe weather. So just be weather aware. I think that people in the Midwest are very tuned into that. They're always kind of paying attention to the weather, but here in the Southwest, gosh, the weather's always nice out here. I don't need to worry about that, but that's just not true. And then all of a sudden, it seems like it came out of nowhere. So like everyone is saying, pay attention to the weather. Most of us all have these phones to get a weather app. You can go to the weather.gov and look up your weather forecast, anything like that. Watch our partners in the media. They will tell you the forecast. And then you can be kind of weather aware. And then last but of course not least is Dr. Gill. Thank you for your expert advice and insight. Any last thoughts from you, sir?
Pleasure to be here. And yeah, I'd just like to really echo what everyone else was saying. In the Southwest, most of the year, we're blessed with really nice, pretty much the weather is pretty much the same from day to day. But as we get into the monsoon, which is our season for the most active and most dramatic changes in weather, we're coming into the time of year, for the next 3-4 months or so, where we really all need to be weather aware. Keep your eyes to the sky, maybe more so than you do in the more complacent times of year. And really, when you have a chance, think about and have a plan for what you might want to do to deal with the weather extremes that really get thrown at us in this part of the country, more in the upcoming time of the year than the rest of the year. So now is the time to really be weather aware. And maybe after you're exposed to some of the severe weather, for again, going back to what we said earlier about valley fever, if you're exposed to dust or extreme heat, and afterwards you're not feeling well and not getting better, realize that this is the time of year especially where, the weather can affect our health, and, be ready to reach out and get treatment and to seek health care if necessary, if you're having some effects from it.
Very good. Good words of advice. All righty. Well, we talked on dust storms. We talked about some of those safety tips. We talked about the challenge in forecasting and detecting these dust storms. But on tomorrow's discussion, we're going to do another hangout tomorrow. But tomorrow's monsoon threat is going to be something that's very difficult to detect. And what I'm talking about is lightning. We can see the lightning, but after we've detected it, it's already happened. So we can say in a thunderstorm there's going to be lightning in this area, but we can't say exactly where that lightning bolt's going to be. But tomorrow's call, a hangout, and you can be looking for the link on your favorite social media channels from the Weather Service, different Weather Service offices, or you can go to NWS, the youtube.com/NWS El Paso, and it has them all listed there. And you can just click on the one for lightning, but it'll be at the exact same time today. And let me see if I can do this again. So tomorrow's hangout on lightning will be 8 p.m. Central Daylight Time, 7 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for our friends in Arizona, and 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So I like to say same bat time, same bat channel, but it will be a different YouTube link. But just check out your local weather office's social media channel, and they will have a link provided there during the day. So again, thank you to everybody who joined us on the call, on this hangout. I thank everybody who were watching us on YouTube. Thank you for the question. Ken Waters tweeted us the answer to that one question that Megan had gotten about the WE alert. So that was great. So it's a great way to interact. Like I said, join us tomorrow as we continue our discussion of the monsoon threats as we talk about lightning. So I want to thank everybody. Have a great evening. Go outside and enjoy the weather, but always keep an eye on it and stay safe. All right. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.